Hey, everybody. This is Joe Harper with Truther Ministries, and we are here for another exciting interview today. And I am very happy to introduce my brother in Christ, Kevin Jandt, to the show. Oh, Kevin, did I get your name right, brother?
Yeah, good. You did good, Joe. Thank you.
So, welcome to the show. I'm really glad you're here today, and I'm really excited for our discussion today. So, welcome to Truther Ministries.
I appreciate it, Joe. Thank you. I know it's you and I have talked a little bit in advance, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having a heart to talk about this stuff.
Okay. Wow. No, thank you. So before we get into our topic today, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and the topic, but I've titled our interview today, it is called Pastoral Abuse, and we're going to be talking what has been called spiritual abuse or the abuse of authority, and I'm going to let you define all that when we get going here today. But I want to start today because I know this is a slightly more difficult topic for many Christians that I just want to say we understand that. We know this is a difficult issue, and this is something we want to talk about biblically. We're both Bible-believing Christians who want to stay true to what the scriptures say, and we just want to encourage people to just give this a fair listen. And our purpose is not to tear down the church, but ultimately we would hope to build up the church, even though we're trying to point out some problems that we see. So that's kind of where our heart is at in this, and we hope that this will be an interview that will bless many people. And yeah, that's just kind of what I wanted to say to start. But yeah, we can go from there. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that before we get going?
No, you're spot on, Joe. I am reluctantly in a ministry of sorts that has been writing, speaking out, talking about spiritual abuse and authoritarianism, cult-like behavior, if not full-on cults, that use the name of Christ. And I'll classify a lot of these as Christian cults. So they talk about orthodox doctrines. They talk about, they don't deny the Trinity. They don't deny penal substitutionary atonement. They don't deny a lot of high-level theological concepts, or even low-level. They would call themselves a Christian church, and in many regards they are. But where I start looking at where they cross over to the line is, do people get hurt in these churches? And I'm not saying people don't get hurt in everyday run-of-the-mill churches, but I'm talking, do these churches have track records of abusing people? That's right. Where it gets to be pretty sticky for me. And I'd look at Acts 20:28, where Paul talks about, talking to the Ephesian elders about that savage wolves will come in, not sparing the flock. So I define that wolf as somebody that's not spared. They're scattering the flock. And when a wolf attacks a flock, those sheep are left damaged, bleeding, and bruised. And that's where it gets into that area for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out, and we'll talk about this more, this is something that the scripture does have a lot to say on this topic. So that's a really good start for where we're going to go today. But that being said, I didn't introduce you super properly. You were a seminary. You went to Reformed Baptist Seminary, and as you said, you have a couple of blogs writing on this issue, and I'm going to include those in the show notes for this interview. But just to start out, why don't you just tell us a little bit more about who you are, about yourself, about your life story, your experiences, and how you have come to write about this issue, how you've come to this point where you're at now.
Yeah, great. As you said, my name is Kevin Jandt. I'm a 60-year-old guy these days, which seems kind of crazy to me. I don't know how I got to this stage in my life, but here I am. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I've been married coming up on 35 years. I have 4 children, all daughters. The oldest is 26 and youngest is 12. So we had two sets of girls. I have been a Christian. I grew up in the church, like probably a lot of us. Didn't really have a defined faith until a certain point later, in my life. I was around 37, 38 years old. Even a little before that, we really started getting back into the church, maybe when our first daughter was born in 1999. So, I don't really have a clear salvation story, but I do know that we have desired to serve the Lord for many years now, and the one of the churches that we were part of, he really wanted everybody to clearly define their salvation story, and so I think he worked at getting people unsaved so he could save them later on. Whether I was saved there or not, I don't know. I had definitely some moments of sanctification, that's for sure. I can't give him credit for everything, but we did learn even things early on in the beginning of our experience at this church. But I grew up in Iowa, graduated from high school, came out to New Mexico, lived here for 7 years, met my wife, moved back to Iowa, and spent the next 28 years there. Now we're back in New Mexico. We wanted to move here to see my wife's mom through the final stages of her life. So we're here for now. As you said, I graduated from the Reformed Baptist Seminary. It's a wonderful school, great leadership, great instruction, really good, godly men. I'm very happy to be a graduate of the Reformed Baptist Seminary. I'm proud to be a Reformed Baptist in my thinking. But I think there's some problems in this movement. You and I have talked about that, and we can talk about it more. But there's a high emphasis placed on theology, which isn't a bad thing. Men that tend to want to be in the Reform movement tend to want to have a high view of theology, and they should. But my concern is, does it get in the way of loving people and treating them the way Christ wants us to treat them? Is our love of theology higher than our love for humanity? And I think that that's a big concern because, we were a part of that. So anyway, I am no longer in school. I run a timing company, a race timing company. We provide race results for running events across the country. And I've been doing that for 20 some odd years. I've made my living doing that, and I enjoy it. So that's the flyover version of my life.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm really glad that you pointed out talking about what you see in the Reformed Baptist movement, because you and I theologically we're both right there.
Yep.
Particular Reformed Baptist stream. And what I want to say is what you said about how you can be, when you're in this movement, you meet some very brilliant men theologically, and that's great. I mean, we should want doctrinal precision. We should want truth. That's all great. But if you're missing the heart, you're missing compassion for people, then we've missed it. We've missed it completely at that point. And I think that's something that many people who have been in Reformed Baptist churches have seen. And I think there's an issue where the as you said, the doctrinal statement can be orthodox, but there can be a legalistic culture that leads to people getting hurt. And so I think you're right on the money there, and I think that's a good starting point for where we're going today. So I think that's great.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. It's just like, I really want it to be a great movement. I really don't see any other organizations. I mean, there are certainly some Presbyterian groups that are well grounded, but I don't really see anybody that has such a desire to root out the meaning of the scriptures and dig in and really give credit to the brilliant men that have come before us. You don't see it in big evangelical churches in the same manner. So we need to do that, right? We need to do that, but we also need to do this, right? We need to treat people well. We need to love them. We need to serve them. We need to proclaim the gospel to them. It's not a one and done thing.
Right. Absolutely. Before we go on to the next questions, is there anything more you want to talk about your experiences with your church and how you started to write about spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
Any more details you want to fill in there?
Yeah, I can talk about that. In let's see, I can't remember exactly the year, but it was early 2000s. We started attending a United Methodist church. It was a wonderful church. It really rejuvenated and renewed our excitement for Christianity, my wife and I. Um, and we really began to grow and desire to serve the Lord. Uh, in that time, the youth pastor there went out and planted a church, and some things didn't quite work out well with him. And he's still a dear friend, and I believe a wonderful brother. But what happened was another guy ended up becoming the pastor of this church, and he's been the primary topic of a good chunk of my writing. And we didn't at first identify it. So it was around 2008, 2009, and we, got fully invested in the church. And he began talking about Reformed doctrine. He had studied Calvin and MacArthur and Sproul, and, these guys had a heavy influence on him. So it was in that time that I did embrace Reformed theology. So again, I'm not saying everything he's ever done has been bad, but at the underlying root of this is just this control issues coming out of him. And a lot of people left right away. A lot of people just didn't like Reformed doctrine, but there was also a hint of his management style, if you want to call it that. So we spent a lot of years there, and I want to say 3 or 4 years before we left, my wife really started seeing the heaviness of it, and the legalism and the control and the digging too deep into what was going on. So fast forward to 2018, we decided to leave and wrote them a letter explaining, or trying to explain. I had had many conversations with him about our growing distrust, dislike of what was going on. So it wasn't as if he didn't know these things were coming, but we finally left. And then subsequently, within a week or so, we were excommunicated. We hung out in Davenport for a year, and then we had sold our business, and then we moved to New Mexico. And I didn't start writing about them until we moved here. And there wasn't any nefarious reason behind that. We had lots of communication with them in that year. There was no way they were going to admit to anything or change anything. And so ultimately it came down to the fact that I said, this stuff needs to be talked about. So I read a book called Churches That Abuse, and I wrote a 5-article series about churches that abuse. Never said a thing about them, but they were catching the hint. They were seeing the articles. And then it was after that I began naming them and talking about them specifically, about the problems that are in, the legalism isn't just the issue. Yes, there's legalistic tendencies, but there's authoritarian tendencies. And that was the bigger problem. It was the control. It was the heavy shepherding. It was we got to know everything about your life, and we got to have a say-so in everything that goes on in your life. And so that was where we started coming to these conclusions. And I talked to my wife, and we decided to write some articles. So I talked about 3 articles. I talked about excommunication was one. I talked about testimonies of people that had left before, how they were, and this was over a period of the life of the church, 10, 12, 15 years at that time. And then I also wrote one other article. I'm blanking on what it is right off the top of my head. But, we did that, and that really got people excited, not in a good way, fired up, And so then it all kind of began. People started noticing it. People picked it up. I went on a podcast called Apologetics Live with Andrew Rappaport and Anthony Silvestro. They really got things stirred up even more. And so that's where we are. I've continued to write as people have contacted me. Recently, a man left the church, Dennis, and he was treated poorly there. And he's autistic. He's 55 years old. He was referred to as retarded. They called him, Mike, the pastor, called him Rain Man, called him Water Boy. Just a lot of really egregious things. And of course, all in jest, right? I mean, really funny stuff, because, the guy likes to screw around a little bit, but it just was improper. And so we've continued to be a thorn in their side, I guess.
Yeah. Well, first off, hearing that, and you've mentioned that to me off camera too, but that's just a sad thing to hear, that someone who's supposed to be a shepherd,
Yeah.
is even if he's claiming it's in jest, saying things that are just unkind, unloving, just so contrary to what the heart of a shepherd is supposed to be. That's very grieving to hear that.
Yeah.
But the other point I'd like to make is, you said just now that it's not just the legalism that may be part of it, but you said it's the authoritarianism. And
Yeah.
what you're identifying as the issue is that these men, pastors in the Bible, are granted properly defined authority, but they're overstepping that. They're going to a place where the scriptures are telling them they should not go. So maybe you could speak a bit more to defining what is correct biblical authority for a pastor and what is not. What does the Bible say about what it should be, and then what should it not be? Where are they overstepping the mark?
Yeah, that's a great point as well. The scriptures outline what it means to be an authority. We have the classic verses, of course, Hebrews 13, 17, 13:7 is kind of a lead up, providing some context to Hebrews 13:17. I just wonder how many people that are listening, how many times has your pastor preached on authority? How many times does that come up in regular conversation? How often are they yielding authority over your life? For us, that was a daily occurrence. It was constantly talked about. The authority. We are the authority. We are your authority. I mean, it was so overbearing. And they had to, in cults and in let's call it a high demand group. That's another term that we can use for these types of churches. They have a high demand from their people. They have to establish these things, and they teach on them regularly and frequently, because you got to drill this stuff into people's heads. And it's like I can pull that stuff up like nothing, because it's been drilled into my head so many times and for so many years. So having a proper balance, I'm not saying a pastor doesn't bear some authority in the life of a congregation. They're called to watch over the souls. They're called to be an overseer, to protect the flock from bad influences that might come in. So all those things are important. But do you have the authority to look into the bedroom of a congregant and determine how many times it's appropriate for a husband and wife to be intimate? And by the way, how are you doing that? What kind of positions are you taking on? What are you doing certain times of the month? So I don't want to be too graphic, but I want you to understand this is the kind of questions and stuff that is probed into deeply in the lives of the people in this place. So, is that authority? Is that proper authority? I don't think so. I think it's like, you ought to care. One of the things that I had wrote when you had asked me a few questions is like, if I know of somebody that is in an adulterous affair and they're in the congregation and we hear about it, let's say I'm a leader sure, we should go to them right away and say, hey, man, I hear this is going on. Is this true? That's a starting point. If it's determined it's true and it won't stop, there's a proper use of church authority and discipline. But the other example I used, and a lady was excommunicated for this, the charge was not loving the body. Okay, now, first of all, define that. What do you mean by that? How does that work itself out? Well, she was a single woman, and she was supposed to help babysit kids, because in a good, quiverful movement type church, you're going to have a lot of kids with, big families. And she was expected to do things like babysitting or cleaning the church, like literally getting down on her hands and knees and cleaning around the toilets. And she was a bigger woman, and it was problematic for her, So I would say, is it appropriate for the leadership to love this woman by not expecting some of these things from her? Oh, I could tell you a lot more about this, but it's egregious. And so in my view, those are not proper uses of authority.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No, no good.
I'm glad that I know you didn't want to go into too much graphic detail, but I'm glad that you painted enough of a picture to say what these men were doing is they were making themselves Lord over the conscience. And they were, with their words or their exhortations or their questions, they're going to places that the Lord and the Bible would talk about this, that they should not be, things they shouldn't be talking about at all.
Yeah.
They're going into matters that are really, in terms of marital matters, would be between the husband and the wife. And then in general, they're just making themselves Lord over the conscience completely. So it's not as if you were just some disgruntled guy who didn't want to be under the shepherding of pastors. You're saying this is something that was very cult-like and very, very twisted and authoritarian, if I can use those words.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it is. And, the thing that, they would say is, well, if certain things aren't occurring in a marriage, it's sinful, and we need to deal with that. It's a heart issue. It's a shepherding issue. And yeah, well, okay, maybe. But is this being asked for? Are a husband and wife asking for shepherding in this area? And that might be a different discussion. But what they will do is they will pry in, and they will ask things, and they will start learning the patterns, and they will start learning, and they can identify, oh, okay, well, we know that this couple is going to have some problems in this area. And so, they really work hard at getting to know people enough and prying into their personal business enough that they will determine if that's an appropriate topic to take. And then they'll probably call you in for marriage counseling and bully and intimidate you in a meeting with 3 or 4 of them. And, that's the kind of stuff that happens.
Yeah, that's not okay. I'm going to read here. I want to read 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2, and specifically verse 3, because I think this will be helpful for us.
Yeah.
Talking about authority, but then the overstepping of authority. So this is 2 elders, and this says, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. And then verse 3, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples of the flock. So the scriptures talk about how elders are not supposed to lord over the consciences of their people. They're not supposed to overstep their authorities and go into areas that should really be between them and the Lord. Yeah. And there's so much more we could say on this, but I think this is a verse that is very relevant for the discussion we're having here. And I wanted to read it just because it gives some biblical warrant to what we're talking about. It shows that, yes, the Bible does talk about this, just as you were talking about in Acts, talking about how Paul warned against those wolves. 1 Peter chapter 5 is another verse we could go to, another example of how the Bible gives very clear warnings that elders are not supposed to lord over the consciences of their people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. I agree with you. And, I think I've struggled to think what this guy thinks about himself. Um, does he really know that he's done this damage, or does he really think he's helping people out? I can't come to a decision other than I believe he knows what he's doing, because it's been pointed out to him now for close to 20 years. And there's been, boy, without even having to think too hard about it, I could easily line up 100 people that would support my testimony. So, and that's over a 20-year period. So like I said, early on in the interview, which is just like, if you do this if this is a pattern of your ministry, that's a problem. And I don't think that every pastor is abusive. I think probably everyone in the pastorate, everyone that's an elder, can be accused of something at times, and can be, who knows? We're all human, right? I mean, nobody's perfect, and people do make mistakes. But I think what they do is they work at correcting. And this guy's always real keen to use that phrase, semper reformando, always reforming. We're always reforming here. And I'm just like, I think the only way they've reformed is backwards. They have not reformed in a positive way forward. And, it's just like, man, you're still pulling the same tricks out of the same old bag. I don't know how you see that as reforming, but whatever.
Yeah, and I can say for that I mean, you talk about men who can preach very eloquently. These are intelligent guys. They're not foolish or not stupid or unintelligent
Mhm.
men. I mean, I'm not closely associated with a situation. If it's been pointed out, you can't claim ignorance, right? If you come to me as a brother, let's say over a period of years, and you point out my sin to me time and time again, he's like, okay, well, Joe's not an idiot. He's well read, whatever. I can't hide behind I don't know. I don't know if that's a helpful comment or not. I hope it is, but that would be my guess based on what you're saying, that this has been pointed out time and time again. I would say that you're probably correct in saying he does know what he's doing, I would say. And I say that really because that's true for many elders who are in these positions, because this problem goes on in multiple churches.
Yeah, it does. And then they're just stiff-necked, which is like, I know better than you. And one of the things that he said to me, and I'm sure this is a line that he uses when people get to the stage where we were going to leave, he says, "Have you surpassed me?"
Oh, wow.
At the time, I was still trying to be fair with him and kind. And I said, "Well, of course not, pastor," because he had to call him pastor. Well, I would say, yeah, I definitely had surpassed you at that point in time. And I've definitely surpassed you by now, because I actually have a seminary degree. Now, that's not to make myself sound important or good, because I don't think that at all. I think that he has developed a theology of his own mind, and he has stayed in it and just circled around in it. He's never tried to go out and educate himself or take critical feedback, and actually apply it, because he knows better. And so, and I know you went to seminary too, Joe. So when you first go, it doesn't take but one or two classes, and you're like, oh, wow, man. The old saying, you don't know what you don't know. Man, in one class, you can figure that out pretty quickly. You don't know what you don't know. And but when pretty much got everything dialed in and figured out, it's really hard to learn anything, and it's really hard to grow beyond your own capabilities. And that's a big problem there.
Yeah, absolutely. And and this is the thing about Reformed theology, I believe they are high doctrines, they are great doctrines, but we know that knowledge puffs up.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful and you don't maintain humility, you can start to think that you know it all and you have a corner on everything. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because it leads to that type of stiff-necked posture that you're talking about. And I think this is why the Bible talks about how you shouldn't lay hands suddenly on any man.
Mhm.
It's the same reason why you don't put a novice in, because pride can be very destructive. And then when you're given um, that office, which I think is a place of honor, and it should be a place of honor properly defined, that can be a great temptation for a man who doesn't have, by grace, have that integrity that's necessary to handle those temptations that come with leadership. And you can become a very narcissistic and controlling person, and you can do a lot of harm to the sheep.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I'm obviously no psychologist, but I have studied a lot of these things, and I've read a lot. I mean, Chuck DeGroat's book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, is a great book. I don't agree with everything Chuck says or writes, but he does write from a pastoral counselor's heart, and he identifies a lot of big issues. There's really a lot of quality reading out there for people that want to study this. I mean, you and I've talked about a number of the books. I mean, Bully Pulpit by Michael Kruger is probably one of the most recent. There you go, there it is. And I wrote Dr. Kruger and told him how much I appreciated his work. And I mean, within a day or two, he wrote me back, and I was very impressed by that. And there's other good ones, like Ken Garrett is a pastor in the Portland area, and he wrote a book called In the House of Friends. It's one of my favorites because it's written from a really, like, I'm in the know perspective, because he went through it. I mean, literally, like, his daughters were abused in the church, and it's just like a lot of crazy stuff. Of course, Enroth's churches that abuse, and then you can go stretch out a little bit. Sinclair Ferguson, the Whole Christ, really talks about legalism and antinomianism, and how do we, these aren't opposites, they're different side of the same coin. It's just a different side of the ditch. How do we be down the middle? How do we live a life that glorifies Christ, that doesn't take our grace for granted, but also doesn't try to domineer and control over people, which it does.
Absolutely. And I did really enjoy, going back to the resources real quick. I'm not as well read on this as you. I did really enjoy as well Bully Pulpit. This would be a book that I would recommend. And I think Dr. Kruger teaches at Reformed Theological Seminary.
Yep. It's
I think
he's on the East Coast, like they have multiple campus, but he's on the East Coast somewhere, South Carolina, North Carolina. I don't remember exactly where it is, but yeah. RTS.
I know they have multiple campuses, but I remember when I was getting into this topic a little bit a few years back, and he said he's more of an academic, and he had done things related to apologetics or the canon of scripture, those more academic topics. Yeah. And he realized the need for this. Whatever his circumstances was, he saw that this was going on. He wrote his book. So I'm very appreciative of it. I think it's very well written. I think with this issue, like anything, as you pointed out very well, there's some things that are going to be better than others. There's pitfalls and ditches when you read about any issue, really. So I think that's a good distinction. But I think Kruger is a pretty safe place to go for a biblical, Bible believing Reformed Christian. That's not going to lead you astray while still pointing out the issue. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And even while we were still at Grace Fellowship in Davenport, we had gone on a vacation one year down to Florida, and I had a desire to pursue education. And I even approached one of the elders there, and he's like, nah, you don't need to get in a seminary. We'll teach you everything you need to know right here at the church. And I'm just like, okay, right. So I, on my own, found RBS, would have never known that probably 10 years later I would have gone to school there. But I found RTS, their online courses, and I took the course on, it was Dr. Kruger, and I think it was on, might have been on one of the Peters. I don't remember exactly, but I think he was the instructor, and I'm just like, man, this guy's really sharp, and there's a lot to learn here. And, his study is in New Testament. He's a New Testament scholar. He's he deals with manuscripts and, that kind of stuff. He's a super smart guy. Why would he write about something like this? Obviously, he saw a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's super helpful. Let's move along to the next question, if that's okay. You've already started to talk about church discipline, and I think this is one of the more important questions, because oftentimes in abusive churches, church discipline can be weaponized against the sheep if it's not enacted properly. Now, we both believe there is a correct use for church discipline. You've already said this.
Yeah.
There are times where it needs to be used. It should be used. The Bible does teach on this. So maybe you could define and speak to a little bit more about what is the proper use of church discipline, and what are some instances or examples of how it can be used or weaponized against the true sheep.
Yeah. I think what I said earlier is relevant. I think this is just my opinion. Okay. I mean, people can agree, disagree, whatever. I think there should be clearly defined sin. Like, it should be clear. If I was robbing banks, I think that, and I was a member of a church in good standing, and I was found out, or I was arrested, I could be and should be disciplined for that. Now, I'm probably going to go to jail if I get caught. But the other thing is, I'm hanging out at a bar every Friday, Saturday night, getting drunk, not taking care of my family, refusing to work, get caught being addicted to pornography or something like that. I think those are clearly defined sins that a New Testament believer shouldn't be participating in. And I think that could be brought up. Charges could be brought, an accusation could be made. We could, if somebody else knows, we can follow the Matthew 18 process. All those kinds of things are appropriate uses of church discipline, all the way down to excommunicating somebody or putting them out of the church if they refuse to, repent of their sins. And so that's easy for me to see. But there's other areas that I suppose are not as clearly defined and could properly use church discipline. I don't know if I have a good example for you, but the other thing is ridiculous things like being excommunicated after you leave. Is it a sin to leave a church? Some people think it is. The elders of our former church thought it was a sin. And so they excommunicated us for leaving. And then they'll come back and say, well, you didn't practice Matthew 18. Well, I think I did go to the pastor and let him know that we were uncomfortable. We were unhappy about some things. And, I didn't lay it out to him that we were going to leave, but he had a good idea. So is that a reason to, well, say I didn't practice Matthew 18 and I didn't follow the proper procedures, right? Does that still mean that I should be excommunicated for leaving? So I think those are areas. Like I talked about the lady that wasn't loving the body. How do you define that? What's the objective standard that we use to say that's church disciplinable? Not a word, but is that a reason to use church discipline? I don't think so. So, I mean, we could dive in a little bit more to things if you had questions, but I think that's how I define it.
Yeah, and I think you've laid out what the principles are. that
Yeah.
you're saying when you see clear sin, because I've thought about this a lot too. And there's a time, like, what should be the heart behind discipline? If I see my brother going astray,
Mm.
and you gave some examples, but if, let's say, he's going off and he's not married and he's sleeping with a woman, and you're
Mhm.
like, and that's so destructive for the soul. He's getting drunk, on drugs, whatever example you want to use. It's coming from a place of, this is destructive. This is contrary to the clear Christian life. This is very clear. These aren't those, what's the term? It's not those daily remaining sins, but these are
Mhm.
very clearly defined serious sins. Well,
Mhm.
then it's actually sinful to not go and confront. And you speak it in love, but you speak it with the severity that's appropriate to the situation, and
Yeah.
say, brother, I'm concerned. If you don't turn away from this, this is an issue. This is going to really do serious damage to your spiritual life. That's the heart of what it should be. But if you're using it to, as you said, um, you're squashing all dissent, and then you're trying to use excommunication to harm people who are leaving. That's something
Yeah.
very different. Not loving the body. That's, how do you define that?
Yeah.
Gossip and slander is one that in many of these churches, that those words are thrown around a lot as well.
Yeah.
And that's, no, I think gossip and slander are very, very clear sins at times, but I think those words have been abused, and it gets to the point where it can become the boy who cries wolf. If you throw those words around so many times when it's not actually appropriate, then when that real sin is there, it's lost all meaning at that point,
Yeah.
because elders can use those words to just shut down any dissent.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree. I wrote an article on slander, and the biggest thing is that it's easy to say, Kevin is the number one slanderer of this church. He's a liar, a gossip, and a slanderer about us. Okay, well, let's tell me. I'm a Christian. You even said I was a Christian in some of the letters that you wrote to me. Define those terms for me. Where have I gossiped about you? And where have I slandered? So if I'm going to slander somebody, number one, I have to say something about them that I know is not true.
Right. It's
Okay.
conscientious. It's
Yes.
conscientious. Right.
So the example I use, I'll go back to my bank robber. I know that Joe Harper is a bank robber. He's been robbing banks all across the southeast area of Minnesota. And, he's doing this and blah, blah, blah. Well, I know that's not true. And if I say it is, then I'm slandering you. Or if I write about it, it's actually called libel. It's not slander, it's libel. So I'm really a libeler. But see, the things that I've written about our old church, I know they're true. And I have witnesses that will support what I'm saying. So that does not mean it's slander. They don't like it, but just because I say something mean about them or something that they don't like, it doesn't make me a gossip or a slanderer. So I think it's really important to describe and to define those terms and use them in a right way. Now, if they say I'm a slanderer and they can't show me where I'm slandering them, then they're actually slandering me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, so if I come to you with the concern that I believe it's true, and I have good reasons why I believe that true, even if discussions later proved that I wasn't completely on the mark, I didn't slander you.
Right.
Correct? I mean,
Right.
there's a distinction there. It's slander is a malicious, intentional attempt to destroy someone's character.
Yeah.
And you can't just throw that out to say, this person has a concern, you bring it forth. Even if that person genuinely believes that the concern is not valid, it doesn't give you the right to just jump to use that word slander.
Yeah.
So we have to define our terms a little bit. And
Yeah.
then another thing I wanted to say, because you talked about how, and I've heard this before in my own church experiences, people will say, well, you didn't use Matthew 18.
Mm,
And there can be an overemphasis on the procedural aspect of the 3 steps.
yeah,
Because Matthew 18 says step number 1 is you go directly to your brother. And that's the
yeah,
heart of it. Is I think what the scripture is saying, if you want to put it in street parlance, is you try to work out your problem with your brother.
yeah,
You try to speak, you talk through things, you have humility, you listen to each other, you're willing to receive rebuke when it's appropriate. Those are all great principles. And yes, it does go to step number 2. You bring in people to help mediate. And step 3 is, if necessary, you take it to the body of the church, the congregation. That's all great. But even Kruger talked about how you can twist that and overemphasize these procedures to shut down any dissent or to
yeah,
shut down any valid questions or concerns. And that's really not the heart of what the scriptures are teaching. And I would go as far to say that's a twisting of what the scripture has to say at all.
yeah. It's actually is my most recent article, and I called it the Matthew 18 dilemma. And I was provided a video that the elders of Grace Fellowship produced, and they produced it 3 years ago, maybe. It was a 2-hour video that were basically not naming me, but they were answering all the things that I was talking about. And so one of the big things and I've taken clips of that video and made blog articles out of it to dispute what they're saying. And so one of the things that they've done is, none of these people followed Matthew 18, and so they create what I labeled as a closed loop system, so they'll say you're in sin if you left. You're in sin because you left. They're in sin because they didn't follow Matthew 18. They're in sin because they don't have the authority to leave a church. And so, it becomes this, you can't disagree. You're stuck in this perpetual loop, right? If I practice Matthew 18, they're going to tell you why you're wrong. If I don't practice it, I leave. And so they use the lack of following the procedure as more evidence as to why you're in sin. And there's no way to escape such a thing. And, so it's psychologically, there's a term called process substitution, and it says focusing on how a concern is raised rather than whether the concern is valid. Okay, so I say there's authoritarianism, legalism, cult-like behavior, a narcissistic pastor, and they say, who cares? You didn't follow Matthew 18. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. You didn't follow the proper procedure, so we're dismissing your case. And you see how harmful that can be to the person and how frustrating that can be? Well, now I got to go against this authority structure who's heavily focused on authority, and man, they're going to beat you up. And so that's what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And you really did a great job of pointing out how you can be put in the corner because they're twisting everything where you're left with no options.
Right.
Because let's say you go, and many people who have these problems, they will at some point express their concern directly. And I would go too far to say you can't throw that principle out. Obviously, you do need to express concerns to people directly. That is what the Bible says. But let's say for the sake of argument that you've raised a concern, it's been shut down, there's no open ear. Well, you're in sin if you go to anybody else in the church because that's slander.
Right.
And then you're at sin if you leave. So you're boxed in. You got no moves.
Yeah,
And
there's no way that's the closed loop system. You can't get out of it. There's no way. And I wrote a couple articles called the Hotel California Doctrine. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And it is really it's really hard. So then what do? You leave. You just leave. And that's the only proper way to do it. And then you're criticized for doing that. They never came and talked to us. They never practiced Matthew 18. They just slipped out the door. One of the most brilliant men, who's a simple guy, a farmer, a friend of mine, him and his wife, they went there for a long time. After seeing everything that happened with us and everybody that left after us, he wrote him an email or a letter and said, "We are leaving. Do not contact us. Do not have any communication with us. And we are gone. And if you have any questions about this, reread it." And that was it.
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. And, and they still showed up at his house. But, anyway, that was the way to do it.
Well, I'll tell you, brother, I had similar experiences where I was a member of a Reformed Baptist church and a member in good standing at that whole time for 5 years. And even though I got to the point where there was disagreements with the pastor and we never got to a plurality of elders, which is a whole other topic, but I won't go there right now. But basically, it got to the point I left with no accusations of sin made against me. And basically, and even after I left, he wanted to meet with me again. I went and met with them one more time for 4 hours with mediators. And the context of that meeting was they said, well, he's going to confess his sin to you, Joe, because they were worried about me leaving. They were worried about the ripple effect. So and he wanted me to come back. But when I got into that meeting, there was no real confession of anything. And I said, well, look, I'm willing to forgive on a heart level. And I know this is the next question, but I said, but I'm never going to trust you again as a shepherd, and I'm going to leave. Yeah. And I said, I believe because I have caught you in clear lies, I believe you're disqualified from the ministry. And after that, it was all about, even though I had never been accused of any sin, they were trying to follow me out the door and sending emails to wherever I went. And it was becoming, well, Joe's the problem, even though that's never what the context had been.
Sure.
And I've talked about some of my experiences on other videos or whatever, but I'm just giving some of this context to say, I know what you're talking about. My experience isn't identical to everybody else, but I've seen enough to know the truth in the things that you're laying out. I've seen it in my own life.
Yeah. Kruger called that flipping the script, and maybe that's not unique to him, but that's what it is. You've taken the concerns and you flipped it into, this guy's the bad guy. Look at him. He's bringing it up. He's maligned our character. He's done all of this and that. God forbid we just want the truth. No, we don't get the truth. We get character assassination.
Right. In kind of in communist or liberal circles, there's a quote that's sometimes been attributed to Marx, sometimes to Saul Alinsky. They'll say, well, accuse the other side of doing exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I'm not saying that all the men who do this are communists or subversives. That's not my point. But when you do that type of thing, you're using the tactics of the devil. Yeah. And I'm not ashamed to say that. That's what it is. If you're committing a sin, maybe you're the one slandering, you're the one misrepresenting somebody's character, and then you accuse them of doing that. Well, you've become the liar. You've become the deceiver. That is a children of the devil move. And we need to recognize that for what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's Saul Alinsky, his what is his rules or whatever. There's like 10
rules for radicals. I was looking it up. Yeah. I'm not sure if I've heard it's in that book, but I've heard others say that the quote isn't directly there. So I'm trying to be careful not to misquote it.
Understood.
But I think the point stands, right?
Well, listen.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't need to go political on this thing, but look at what's happening to Joe Kent. This is exactly what they're doing to him. How dare he say Iran is no imminent threat to the U.S. and then leave over a matter of conscience? No, they're not going to say, is that true or not? They attack the man's character. And so just like in Christian circles, just like in political circles, unless you're on the team, don't you dare say anything bad about the team. You can leave, but don't you dare say anything, So that's the way it works, right? They're going to come after you.
Yeah, and let me say this at this point. This might be the right time to say it. People who have experienced these things, oftentimes they'll find out this is going on in multiple churches.
Yeah,
It's a very widespread issue. It's not
it
just a
is.
few. It's not just a few bad apples. And I am concerned about how wolves have come in, not sparing the flock. And I don't need to point to this group or that group, whatever. But you see these men are using these type of tactics of villainizing good Christians for trying to just be part of the church. And
Mhm.
that's really an issue that needs to be talked about more. It's something that needs to be identified precisely. And that's something that we need to work. We need to try to root out the bad apples. And there needs to be a lot of work in this area. That's what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
absolutely. One of the shows I like to listen to, I don't listen to a ton of podcasts, but I really like the Sean Ryan show. And Sean was talking about, pedophilia and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, pedophiles show up as teachers. They show up in churches. They show up where kids are, right? Why is that? Well, why do narcissistic personalities tend to show up in the pastorate? And that is really true because they can get their fix by being able to domineer and control people, and all under the authority of God, because they're ordained by God, or they're appointed by God, or they're called of God. And so, bad actors show up where they can do what they do. And you're exactly right. It's just not a few churches. I mean, there's a lot of groups out there now that this is gaining popularity like anything else, right? So you've got churches that seek to expose the CREC and Douglas Wilson. You got Sons of Patriarchy. You had Christianity Today do a series on Mark Driscoll and the rise and fall of Mars Hill. You have another podcast, I think, is in Minnesota, Preacher Boys. He looks at exposing fundamentalist Baptist churches and others as well. And so it's not that the segment has grown. It has, but it's grown because there's a need for it. And these places are all over the place, and people are growing up in them, and children are growing up in it. And, these places tend to have a lot of children. So there's going to be a lot of children affected. And, I don't mean to keep saying I wrote an article, but I've written so many articles on different topics. And I wrote one I called Breaking Amish. And, there was a show on A&E or something like that, where these Amish kids, they came to an age and they go off the rails. And I know that's going to happen in these strict fundamentalist cultures. Look at the Duggar family. Another one of those boys was just arrested. So you don't get to do this. You don't get to have this kind of strictness with people and your families and the culture that you're in without things getting broken. It happens, and it's going to happen, and it's going to be bad. It's all coming home to roost.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's okay, I'm going to read before we go to the next question. I think I was debating whether I should, but I think I'm going to read Third John here
Okay.
on Diotrephes.
Yeah.
On a lighter note, I always butcher the name of Diotrephes, but I
No,
think
you're
this is
good.
so. This is verse 9 and 10. I think this is a helpful passage of scripture on these topics, and so this says, yeah, Third John verse 9, 10, only one chapter.
Yeah.
I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, receives us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deed which he doeth, prating us with malicious words, and not content therewith. Neither does he receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and cast them out of the church. So you have here a picture of a person who had come in and was even opposing the true teachings of the apostles, and he was forbidding those in that congregation to fellowship with John and the others, and even weaponizing excommunication. And here it says casting them out of the church, same thing.
Yeah.
He was weaponizing that to support, one, his love of preeminence, the text says that,
Yeah.
and two, his false teaching.
Yeah.
And so if somebody says to me that there's no scriptural support for the weaponization of excommunication, I'd say that is not true, because here we have a clear example that it's there. So I just wanted to include that. I think that's helpful.
No, brother, that's perfect. I pulled up my Bible app while you were talking about it because I wanted to look at it too, and I read a little different translation than the King James, but I love it. And I had a little note. It says great potential blog post. So yeah, I mean, I should have written them on this one a long time ago, and maybe you've just rejuvenated my interest in it. But it's so spot on to what this pastor does. I mean, he loves the preeminence. He loves the greeting in the marketplace. He loves to be called pastor, and he loves people to acknowledge him. And he'll take them to lunch after church and ask him, "How'd you like my sermon? You know, tell me what you liked about my sermon." It's just like, man, I mean, we've been at lunch with him when he's done it, so I know it's true. I've sat there and listened to it, but it's just like, you know, nothing is new, nothing is different. These guys work from the same playbook. They acknowledge the same things. They do the same things. It's nothing new, but it is seemingly, like Kruger asked the question, is it more prominent, or am I just hearing about it more now? I don't know, man. I think it's more prominent, you know. I think as culture decays, and it continues to decay more and more, I think this stuff is, you know, Satan is going to attack in ways that look like these guys are decent, upstanding pastors of churches, but they're really not. You know, they're evil guys at heart.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this has probably always gone on to one extent or another.
Sure.
But I think in our day in evangelical circles, it is intensifying. And you could go to charismatic circles too, and they have abuse where they'll claim revelation from God to support it instead of maybe trying to use Reformed doctrines. It can be the same thing at heart. But anyway, it can be in different contexts. But I know in the Reformed Baptist circle, and that's the circle we've been in, this is very prominent.
Yeah.
And it's something that, it needs to be addressed. Well, that being said, though, I think I'm going to move on. We have 2 more questions, so we'll try to get these covered. So we're going to talk here about reconciliation, and once again, you've already started to speak to this a little bit, but sometimes manipulative men can twist what the Bible says about reconciliation for their own purposes. Now, we know that reconciliation, once again, is a great, wonderful doctrine that the Bible teaches, not only about our reconciliation with God, but how we are supposed to be reconciled with each other, how we're supposed to be at peace with each other, how we're supposed to forgive one another. That's all great. But these men can twist what the Bible truly says about reconciliation to really try to get you to not speak about their sin. So maybe you can speak to this, and you can define once again what is the true and what is the false, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I think that's good because, you know, they will really try to work this one. Similar to slander, it's really misunderstood and maligned. So the way I look at reconciliation is it would come, like if we're going to define like Matthew 18, and let's say, you know, you and I have a problem and you come to me and you say, "Hey man, you know, I saw this and you did that, and I didn't think that was really Christian." And I'm like, "Man, dude, I didn't think about that. You are so right. Please forgive me for that." Boom, we're reconciled, right? There's no longer this issue between us. But what happened? Number one, you confronted my sin. Number two, I received that. I noticed that you were right. I apologized, recognized my error, sought your forgiveness, and now we're reconciled. So it takes a recognition of wrong, first of all, to be reconciled to somebody. So I'll use an example. The pastor of our former church, at one point in time, sends me a text message and says, I would like to get together with you all. And I can't remember exactly how he worded it. I wrote it somewhere and I've got it written down, but it was just like, seek forgiveness for my cause in the matter. My cause in the matter. That's what he said. I said, we're not unwilling to do that. I said, but can you define for me what is your cause in the matter? What did you do? Why are we getting together? Because I'm not going to sit in front of you and look at you and listen to you unless we've clearly defined terms, again, because I know how you are. I know who you are. And I know when I can get and talk, I can talk my way around everything and anything, you know. And so I asked him that directly in a text message. Well, you know, I want to seek your forgiveness. He just repeated the same thing. I'm like, that. Okay, well, we're willing. When you can figure out what your cause in the matter is, you get back with me and let me know. And of course, then he was like a good narcissist. He went from being reasonable to now he's the victim. You won't receive me. You won't accept my apology. I'm like, you didn't apologize for anything. And so reconciliation requires two people that have a recognition of what took place, somebody recognizing they were wrong and seeking forgiveness, and then moving on. That's reconciliation. Now, forgiveness is a completely different thing. I can forgive this guy. Doesn't mean like what you talked about earlier, Joe, which is, hey, I don't trust this guy now. I don't have to be in a relationship with him. I can forgive him so it doesn't hold this bitterness over my heart, but I don't have to be in a relationship with him. So that's my definition of reconciliation.
Yeah. And once again, you did a great job defining what is and what's not. And on the one hand, let's say you and I theoretically we get into a big blow up argument, or let's say there was a long issue. It's gotten pretty big. And you come to me and you truly express your heart of expressing, I believe I've sinned against you. I believe I was wrong here and here. And it's obvious that you're truly expressing your heart and your recognition of the matter. On the one hand, I can say I shouldn't have a checklist of hoping that you say every single little thing absolutely perfect, right? That would
Yeah.
be proud. That would be wrong. I'm not receiving my brother. I'm not forgiving. But that's very different from the other example. What you're saying is if you're someone who's been grievously sinned against, and we're speaking specifically about the context of leadership, and they don't express anything to you at all, and then they're trying to put the pressure on you, you're not reconciling with me. That's the other extreme.
Yeah.
So I give the first example just as a preface to give context
Yeah.
that, okay, we understand that sometimes when we reconcile, not everybody's going to say every little thing perfectly. They may not see everything that we wish they would see. And there needs to be humility and love when people reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very different from somebody who's just trying to get off the hook from any accountability at all. And they're trying to pressure you to dismiss the problem without them expressing any true sin or owning up on their part. That's a very different matter entirely.
Yeah. No, you're spot on. Yeah. You can't say it much better than that. You're exactly right. I can't have an expectation of how somebody will apologize to me, seek my forgiveness. If they say I've wronged you and I truly am sorry for that, wonderful. Let's move on. I forgive you. Let's go forward. But it doesn't mean I have to be in a relationship with you. I can choose to, or I can choose not to. we have a lot of freedom in that regard. And, the thing that we've come to learn as we've studied and read and talked about it is, it's a good idea to remove toxic people from your life,
Yeah.
because they will always be draining, and they will always consume more than they give.
Yeah, and I think living in the world we live in, it's wisdom teaches you that you have to do that. And I think the principle for me, what I've learned is you try to be patient, you try to not rush to conclusions, then you try to express your heart to somebody. But if they don't hear it, there's a time and a place to walk away.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, brother. I think that there's a lot of liberty and freedom in who we associate ourselves with.
Yeah.
I think we know that the Bible does say we're supposed to fellowship with our brethren, but that can be something that can be abused too. We don't need to be um, associated or linked up with people who are ignoring all the sins in their life. That's not what the Bible teaches.
Yeah, that's really good. I agree with you. And you know, you'll always hear things from this guy, oh, I'm not perfect, or we're not perfect, or whatever. I mean, whoever thought that, you know? But do you even acknowledge your sins when they come up, or people call you out on them? Because I think, like, you know, a, a pastor with malicious intent can persuade, especially if he's persuasive, and if he's a narcissist, he's persuasive. But they can always persuade people that somehow they're at, here we are, and I'm just a little bit higher than you are on the sanctification scale. Or actually, I'm a lot higher, and because I'm this minister, somehow I get a pass. And that's just not good. And I refuse to put up with that anymore.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it's true. And
Ask some of the pastors at the churches we've been to since, because they don't always like to hear from me. But I try to be kind. But if I see things, I'm knocking on their door.
Well, I think the point is that the elders are held to a higher standard, and being above reproach means it doesn't mean you don't have any remaining sin in your life, but there is a higher standard for those who are in leadership. Not many of you should be teachers, to paraphrase that verse, because you're held to a stricter standard, and I think that's correct. I think that's good. I think that's right.
Yeah.
But all that being said, I think we've done a pretty good job, I hope, of identifying some of the problems and giving examples of how these things manifest in churches.
Yeah.
So my final question is for you is, what do you think are some ways that the church can move forward? What are some positive strides that can be made to address this issue? What are some ways that you think the problem can start to be fixed?
Yeah. I think there's a couple things right off the top that I think of. Accountability is huge. Who are you accountable to? And if you're the pastor of a small independent church, like a Baptist church, I think it's a good idea to be some part of some kind of an association. Because, like, if there's a single pastor or there's just two elders, you can't turn to a plurality of eldership and say this solves all of our problems. Theoretically, it's supposed to, but you end up having domineering personalities. You end up having a guy whose voice is heard more. It's usually the main pastor, the main preaching pastor. You might even have people that'll push back. But if you don't allow the congregation and you don't allow anybody else to speak into your life, you're going to have a problem. So accountability is huge, and you can't manufacture that. I can't go to Mike Reed and say, dude, you need accountability. And he'll say, I've got accountability. I've got a plurality of elders and blah, blah, blah. and I'm accountable to the congregation. You ain't accountable to the congregation. That's why so many people leave, because you're not accountable to them. You don't answer their questions, and you're in trouble if you ask questions. So accountability is big. I think, man, this might be controversial, but I think doing a personality assessment would be really helpful, because what we talked about earlier is, how these guys end up in this career path is because they look at this as an opportunity to fulfill their narcissistic needs. And if you conducted a credible personality test, you could root some of that stuff out and say, dude, no, thank you. Now, if anybody has half a wit about them and they know a guy leading up to it, if he's known in the congregation, they're going to know how he is. Does he take over the room when he comes in? How is he with his wife? These are kind of the qualification things that Timothy and Titus write about. So like understanding a guy's personality, even if it isn't taking an official psychology test, which I know many of my dear Reformed brothers will push back at, there needs to be an assessment of a man's personality and how he's going to do as a leader. Is he truly a loving, caring type shepherd, or does he wish to domineer over people? So those two things, and I might toss in education. Education isn't a cure-all for everything, because there's plenty of super well-educated men that have been really bad, but I think gaining some education is always a positive thing. So I'm sure I could think of some more, giving me a little bit more time, but just for discussion's sake, I'm going to say those three things right off the bat.
Yeah. The personality test one is probably the most controversial, but I think what you're driving at, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're basically saying, there needs to be proper vetting of the people we're putting in. And I think the Bible talks about how we're supposed to be slow to who we put into these positions. And there needs to be, I think at times there needs to be a lot more rigorous self-assessment amongst who's getting put in before they're put in, because it's a lot easier to not put a bad man in to begin with than to try to get him out later. So that's one thing that crosses my mind. I wrote down just a few, brother, and I would love to just read a few of these, and you can tell me whether you like them or not. The first one I just wrote down the word heart, because no matter how good your policy is, it has to start with not ignoring the deeper matters of the law, things like compassion, mercy, judgment. And I think Kruger talked about this in his book. I read a little bit even as I was just reviewing today. He talked about how we can sometimes want to put in men who do show gifts, who can be eloquent, they can have charismatic personalities, they can be eloquent theologically, but they are not demonstrating care for the sheep. They're not showing character integrity. And because sometimes we can want that king in Israel, as it were, we're judging based on the externals and not judging based on the matters of the heart. It can lead us to put the wrong men in. So that was the first one that I think of.
Great. I love it. That's really good.
I know that's easier said than done sometimes, but it has to, I think that's where it has to start. The second one I wrote down was a correct understanding of elder-led congregationalism. I do believe personally in a plurality of elders, but if we're not careful, it can lead into a de facto elder rule where the congregation really has no say at all. And that's once again, and once again, that's easier said than done. I understand that, but there needs to be, Christians in the church need to understand what our polity is and what it's not. And if having a plurality of the elders means the congregation has no say over everything, that's wrong. That's imbalanced. That's unbiblical.
I think it's because the New Testament talks about the laying on of the hands of the eldership. So that means, in my mind, that means that the congregation has input. They have a role to play in who gets approved as a leader.
Yes.
You know, Mike Reed took advantage of a situation. The guy left and he saw an opportunity.
Right.
The people there were very theologically ignorant, myself included. And so we didn't understand. And hey, this guy's willing to pastor the church, better take him up on that offer. Well, that wasn't good. And then he appointed elders. And so, it quickly became, he got what he wanted right away. And there was no vetting, there was no anything. So you're right, man. That's a really good one. I agree with you there.
Yeah, great. I got two more. My third one is, this is coming, Kruger talks about this in the end of his book, but the need for a greater emphasis on transparency. This is a difficult one for me, because in the sense that I do think elders at times are going to need to have private meetings amongst themselves. So I think you can't swing it too far the other way. But if your leaders are hidden, they're hiding things, there's not enough transparency, people in the congregation are trying to bring forth valid, legitimate questions, and these men are hidden, that's bad. And so I think that there needs to be a culture shift there. There needs to be a greater emphasis on, there is transparency in this congregation. We're not going to allow these men to be hidden about how they're conducting themselves or how business is being conducted in the church.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, great. And then last one, I'll let you comment again, is this is going to specifically to the excommunication one, because I've wrestled, we talked about this off camera. How should we view membership and excommunication? Do I think those are in the Bible? Generally, yes, I do. But I think that the church needs to have clear policies, probably in the Constitution, that members in good standing are allowed to leave, and they should just simply be removed from the rolls. So in other words, there needs to be a check on trying to use church discipline to go after people who left with valid concerns. That I don't see this, where I've heard these elders say, well, you can only leave by being transferred to another church or by being excommunicated or by dying.
Yeah.
That's a complete warping of the Bible. That's nowhere said in the scriptures. I think we can infer membership from the church bringing people in and taking people out. I think that's fair enough. Yeah. But let's be honest, there's no laying out of membership procedures in the Bible. It's not there at all.
No, that's really funny too, because they claim how highly they value the scripture, but I'm just like, what scriptures you cite to support your position on those 3 reasons for leaving a church? Yeah, that's good too. I think you're right. There's so much that could be said on this topic, but I really think we have a friend here in Albuquerque, and he's, you hear it say he's the godliest man I know. This literally is the godliest man I know. He's been a pastor for 40 years, and he is the most loving, caring person. And, he just, he exudes, in my mind, what a Christian pastor ought to be. He has the heart. He serves people. He's not condescending. He's not overbearing. He'll listen to you. He doesn't offer his opinion unless you ask for it. I mean, you could just go on and on about this man. And then you have the other kind that they're just like, man, where did you come from? It's just like, this is not your career field. You ought to be a senator, or you ought to be a stockbroker. This is what this guy was before. You ought to be in a position where you have to use a boisterous personality to get ahead, because that's what you're doing here. And it's not serving the body of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is so helpful, brother. And I think you've painted such a good picture of what the issue is. And I hope that we can at least start to talk about kind of the path forward. I
Yeah.
feel like it's hard. The path forward is hard because I think the problems are pretty deep at this point, but we know the Lord is sovereign and he can work. And I think talking about it is a great first step.
Yeah.
That being said, as we're moving closer to wrapping up, is there any final thing you want to say? Anything on your heart? Anything you want to say before we close up?
No, I, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, Joe, that, you know, you want to hear about it. You want it to be a concern, that, especially in the Reformed world, we fight about a lot of stuff. We fight about our Bible translations, or we fight about our eschatology, or baptism or not baptism, or whatever it is we want to fight about. Oh gosh, Christian nationalism. We fight about everything, but it's just like, what are we doing to ensure that God's word is being handled and preached faithfully by good men that actually care about people, not just about their own agendas. And so I think all you can do is talk about it and write about it, and continue to try to expose what I believe is evil. I believe it is evil. And if I have to be called a liar, a slanderer, and a gossiper, well, so be it. I guess I'll wear that moniker with pride. And it's just like, we want the best for the church. We want to see people come to faith. We want to see people be able to utilize their gifts for the glory of Christ. We want to see the word preached faithfully. We want to see Christ honored in all things. And I don't think that really at the end of the day, these guys do any honoring of Christ in how they treat people. So,
Yeah, amen. And like we said at the beginning, ultimately our goal is not to pull down the church, but to build it up. But
absolutely.
you got to address the problem. And I've thought about, I think people pull back on this issue because when they hear the criticisms, they feel like the church is getting attacked. But I
Mm-hmm.
always think of the proverbial ostrich. You're never going to solve your problem by sticking your head in the dirt and ignoring the problem. I think that's why I talk about things that are more controversial at times for that reason. It's like, well, why? Because you can't fix a problem that you're ignoring.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a younger irresponsible teenager. I wasn't doing my homework or whatever, and that's what my dad would say to me. He'd say, well, Joe, if you ignore this problem, it's not going away. If you don't
Mm-hmm.
deal with it now, you're going to deal with it later.
It's good
And I
advice.
think it was good advice, and it is good advice. And that's kind of my heart on this issue. I know it's painful to see the problem initially. And for people who may not experience it directly, at times they might not want to hear about it, but you're never going to fix a problem until you acknowledge it. And I think that's what we're trying to say with this entire interview.
Yeah, you're right. All you can do is bring the topic up and put it out there, and hope that people will acknowledge that there is a problem. Um, and I think this is a bigger problem than we would understand it. And we talked about that earlier, but it's just like, we want the best for the church. We want good people in leadership. We want, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people in the Reformed movement are quick to point out the heresies or the problems with prosperity gospel, or certain areas of Christianity that they don't have a problem calling it out, but they don't call out their own problems. And so it's just like, we ought to work on our own house, but that doesn't give us license not to talk about other problems. So I
Right.
appreciate you having the courage to do that and to put it on your show, and hopefully lots of people will hear it, engage with it, and consider it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, brother. You're very kind, and thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate you. I appreciate what you've written. I've enjoyed your articles. So thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. God bless you.
Yeah. Last thing before we close off, why don't you just tell everybody the name of your websites, your blogs, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is uncommonfaith.org, uncommonfaith.org. I also, someone said I have to get a Substack account, so I did a Substack account, but I think it's just my name at Kevin Jandt at Substack or whatever the heck it is. But Uncommon Faith is where I do the majority of my writing. I'm also have a Exposed Grace Fellowship, QC.com, I think is the name of the website, where I just talk about that, put some resources on there for those involved in abusive type churches. Wrote a lot of little quick blog articles. They try to be like a minute or 2 minute of just various different things. Like we talked about slander, reconciliation, the playbook. I mean, just really quick little jots about what these places do. And so, yeah, you can find me there. You can search my name and this stuff comes up pretty quickly these days. So I guess I'm keeping the SEO going pretty good.
Well, great. Well, I will include that in the links below the video so people will just be able to click on that and find it really quickly. But like I said before, thanks again for coming on, Kevin.
My joy. Thank you, Joe.
All right, everybody. This has been this edition of Reformed Truther Ministries. This is me, Joe Harper, and my friend Kevin Jandt, and we are signing off. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.